Everybody calls me Iron Mike, and that's a name that I got at the Sedan Underground Mine. And one of the ladies I worked with, when somebody said, well, where did the name come from? Nancy Jamnick said, that's because he's almost as dense as lead, but not quite. And I said, thanks, Nancy, very much. For Richard Watson, I want to thank the Arrowhead Regional Arts Council for helping provide the funding to allow me to go into the archives of the Ely Winton Historical Society and put together what I hope will lead to a formal presentation of Ely history that'll be done a little bit later. Frank Ivancic at the high school history program asked me if I would be interested in coming in this winter, and I'm a proud alumni of Ely High School, and so this was quite an honor for me. But everything's got to start somewhere, and as Judy Jolladin pointed out the last time I did a slideshow, someone had dropped the slides. I had put together 75 slides meticulously in order with a script, and unbeknownst to me, someone had dropped them, and rather than say, oh gosh, I dropped these, they just went and kind of put them back in any way, shape, or form. And it was summertime, and there was a goodly number of people here. And I believe in giving people their money's worth, and I usually always do because I never charge for the program. But tonight, Richard Watson was kind enough for Lutefisk Technology. I even got a laser pointer. Does this mean it was going to be a slideshow, but now is it a PowerPoint? Oh, definitely. Oh, look, you take it, follow the, and he says to me, don't shine it in people's eyes, because he knows deep down inside I'm still like a little boy. But this isn't a formal show. We'll show you some images. Margaret Sweet and the Ely Winton Historical Society. What a wonderful change that computers have made for local technology. I was talking to old friends back in the day when I became interested in local history. I was interested in a waitress named Tootsie Pootzel who worked at the Ely News Store and one of the coffee shops, and Lee Braunell and Judge John Shammy Samrock would come in, and Lee Braunell started collecting pictures when he found out that, you know, your Uncle Frank would croak, and you'd go over to the house and there'd be this big box of pictures of lumberjacks and miners and God knows what, and then who the heck are these people? And so they would be throwing them out in the city dump. And Lee Braunell got a word of what was happening, and he says, oh, goodness gracious, start giving them to me. And when he died, I asked him, I said, how many images do you have, Lee? And he says, 8,000 photographs. And up until very recently, they were in shoeboxes. And right now, thanks to the good work of the Ely Winton Historical Society, 15,000 images have been entered into their computer system. And one of the reasons I'd like to, hopefully that I could live a long time, I never thought in my wildest dreams I'd ever have a chance to sit with the Braunell photo collection on my laptop computer. But those days are here. And basically anybody that comes to Ely, once you come to Ely and live even for a little time, it gets a hold on you and you never forget it. And you become a part of it and it becomes a part of you. And people ask me, how do you define an Ely person? And I says, anybody that lives close enough to hear Father Mike's bells and loves this town, that's all you have to be from Ely. And so we'll take you back. The history in Ely, 1888, to give credit where credit is due. Tower Sedan got the jump on us. in 1884. And a gentleman asked me, am I from Ely? And I explained, yeah, that I was born here. But my great-grandparents were in Norway, Michigan, and they were in their early 20s. And opportunity knocked in the form of Elisha Morcom, who was hired by Charlemagne Tower. And I read the letter that Tower wrote to George Stone, his attorney in Duluth. Behind any business venture, there's always an attorney. And George Stone had recruited Charlemagne Tower to be the investor. And when they got to the Sedan Hill, the cliffs of iron were standing up 30 feet above the greenstone, just like big blue teeth. And it looked just like picking cherries. Well, it was at first. 1883, Jack Armstrong and 50 wildcat miners. That was any guy with 2 arms and 2 legs that could hold a number 2 shovel and would come north from Duluth. And they started mining there, and before too long they realized they were in over their head. Tower had to hire a professional cousin Jack miner from Norway, Michigan, named Elisha Morcom, and he wrote George Stone, "You've ruined me," when he found out how much it was going to cost him to get Morcom's services, and 166 hard rock miners. They took advertisements out in all of the Michigan papers. They promised to pay the people 25 cents more per hour than they were making in Michigan. And the one great thing about mining, Bill LeBeau was my great-grandfather. Their big controversy about the Coca-Cola commercial, when they're singing in the foreign languages, America the Beautiful, and some people getting spun up about that. Most of the people, the immigrant people that I knew in Ely, they were very proud of where they came from, but they wanted to be Americans. Napoleon LeBeau, Bill's father in French Canada, when he found out there was opportunities to cut timber for the Michigan mines because they were fighting the Civil War in the 1860s, he said to his boy, William, "You're not going to parlez-vous français, William. No matter what ma mère might say, you're going to learn to speak English because that's where the money's going to be." Grandpa Verteen, who ran Verteen's Cafe for years, told me essentially the same thing in beautiful Slovenian accent. He says, "Hillman, you go to school, learn to speak good American, Hillman. That way they think you a smart guy." He says, "People listen to Grandpa talk. They don't think he's smart because I speak this way. But you go to school, learn to speak good American, Hillman. Then they think you a smart guy even when you ain't." And there was truth to it. They wanted, my Norwegian grandfather would forbade the kids from speaking Norwegian because he wanted them to be Americans. So my great-grandparents, they came on a special train. Civilization ended in 1884 in Superior, Wisconsin, and they took sledges across the frozen bay from Superior to Duluth, and Duluth was nothing but a random assortment of shacks lined up on the North Shore there, not very formal at all. They have 366 people, men, women, and children, and they divided up into 3 groups because that was what the accommodations. They had to march 3 days and 2 nights, 88 miles up the Vermilion Trail, and you can see they leave Duluth, and where they're heading is right there, and that was 3 days and 2 nights. What this picture is, this is the Lake Superior mining district, and up until 1884, none of this was developed. They knew it was there. George Stuntz found it in 1866, but the thing that they were talking about, the current mineral thing, you know, the minerals have been here for 2.7 billion years, and they're not going to be running away, so don't you worry about it. And until they got to the 1880s, that was when the demand in Michigan could no longer keep up with America's need for iron. And that's when George Riley stunts his mountain of iron there. And that started it off on July the 31st. It was a big investment. A lot of people come here and they think that Winton started before Ely. And for some reason, some of them think that Winton was bigger than Ely. It didn't start before Ely, and it was never bigger than Ely. Winton didn't start until 1896, and Ely was shipping iron in 1888. The reason that the logging didn't develop first, even a blind man, it wasn't hard. I'll show you some logging pictures later on. My God, even Ray Charles could have felt his way and saw how big these pines were up here. But the real mineral wealth, when Lucian Merritt sent his 7 sons, the 7 iron men, out to explore northeastern Minnesota from their fortress in Duluth, he said, keep counting the timber. There's going to be millions of dollars made in lumbering here, but the real money will be made in minerals. So you keep an eye out on the minerals. And it was right. Charlemagne Tower, who was pretty well off, had a few $1 million to spend, but in comparison to the people that were starting to be interested in northern Minnesota, men with the name of Carnegie and Rockefeller and James Pierpont Morgan, Charlemagne Tower was not a real big fish at all. And you can bet that the Chicago Syndicate, some very powerful men watching what was happening here. Tower puts the railroad in from 2 harbors to Sedan Hill, and he hires John Wolfe from Ottumwa, Iowa, same town that Radar O'Reilly came from in MASH. And John Wolfe and Sons have a contract that they will start this railroad in 1883, and that it will ship iron on August the 1st, 1884. And if it does not ship iron on August the 1st, 1884, Charlemagne Tower is going to be out the $1.5 million that he'd already invested in his railroad, and he would lose all of the railroad right-of-ways. So one of the big considerations, and things are not going well for Charlie. There's an influenza breakout. He's got 1,500 men working on this railroad round the clock. And he's in despair. And who does he turn to but Sam Ely, the namesake of our community. They're 2 brothers. We'll take a look at their pictures later on. But Sam Ely bought iron. He was an iron merchant, and he promised his friend Charlemagne Tower, after examining the specimens that he saw, that he would be happy to purchase the first train load of Minnesota iron. Well, poor Charlie's having a tough time. He says to Sam, Sam, we're behind schedule. Nothing's going right. This Wolf is incompetent. I don't trust him. Get up there. Sam Ely takes a look, and he says, Charlemagne, it's going to cost you another $1 million at least, but you've already lost $1.5 million. So what do you want to do? And they doubled the workforce. And on July 31st, 1884, the first train load of iron left Sedan Hill with a day to spare. And my great-grandparents, they got half a day off, and the Indians came in from Lake Vermilion to dance at the special occasion of the first train leaving the Vermilion Range, and everybody in town threw a piece of iron on the 20 wooden ore cars that were made in Red Wing, Minnesota, especially for the occasion. And Tom Owens, the engineer, was scared to death because the darn engine didn't have brakes. And he was so worried that what he was going to do when they got to that 2-mile grade in 2 harbors. But fortunately, things worked out. But next picture there, Dick. There's the Vermilion Range. Everybody says it's the range right now. And that's not true. There were 3 individual iron ranges in Minnesota. The Cuyuna Range was down by Crosby and Ironton. the Vermilion Range, you go from Sedan over to Ely, and if you keep going up the Fernburg Trail, you'll come to the last mine that I know of, and that was Judd Cleveland and the Howard Mine. And that was 1911. He and his brother Willis, they come from Madison, Wisconsin. Willis wanted to make money. Judd was just happy living up in Ely. He knew right away, Willis, that it wasn't going to make any money. So he left for Alaska, and Judd Cleveland spent his whole life there. The little creek on the Fernburg is still called Uncle Judd's Creek. And my father remembers being a boy, going on a fishing expedition, and old Cleveland was still alive. And when his grandfather bought a dozen minnows, the old man counted them out by hand, one at a time, and looked at my father and said, "But you look like a good boy. I'll give you the bonus." And when World War II broke out, Judd Cleveland was a well-known area patriot. And when the war was declared, on the day after Pearl Harbor, they went out and brought him in to town, and he gave a haranguing speech on what he would like to do to those dirty Germans if given a chance. But the Sedan mine, 6 Ely mines, if you go to Miners Lake and look out over the water, and you can imagine going down 1,700 feet, that's pretty much the dimension of the Ely iron ore body. It was, according to the State Geology Survey of 1858, the centennial geology work, that was the richest, Ely, Minnesota, the richest square mile of iron ever mined anywhere in the world at that time. And I believe since then there is a place in Brazil that will eclipse it. But in that little tiny area where Miners Lake is, they took out 82 million ton of iron and God knows how many ton of greenstone. And to compare, the Sedan mine was just about 16 million ton total. So you can imagine just the volume of iron that came out of there. Next one, Dick. It's pretty simple. You college guys, if they do start mining up here, the mining that they're proposing to do on Birch Lake is going to be done with exactly the same method that was done at the Sedan underground mine. Sedan underground mine is 2,341 feet, and these guys are proposing that that working is going to be 6,300 feet down, which is a long, long way. So you college people, stay in school, study hard, because that's an awful hard way, underground mining, to make money. And you can see the shaft, drop her down, up on top. I forget I have a pointer. The mining is done up here, the haul line to get the ore back to the main shaft and up and out. And you got to keep in mind, this iron is 360 pounds a cubic foot. So it didn't take a real big chunk to do you a lot of harm if it drops down from an 80-foot ceiling. And in Ely, Sedan mine, they lost 13 men from 1884 to 1962. The Ely mines, it was 213 miners that were killed. And I can remember, I was old enough, I was 14 years old when the last mining stopped in Ely. And I can remember listening. Do you remember, Cecilia, hearing the whistle? Yeah. And almost a universal thing for anybody that lived in Ely. There'd be so many mud runs and cave-ins. And there'd be 32 rescue miners that were the best and the bravest in the mines, because they would be digging out the guys that were trapped. And these whistles would blow. And in school, if we were in school, the teacher would just go and sit at the desk. If it was church service, the minister would stop preaching, because everybody was galvanized. I can remember being in elementary school in the Washington school and looking out the windows towards the mine. And one Saturday, eating Cheerios, and the emergency whistle started blowing, and I'm stopped with a spoonful of Cheerios halfway home, and my mother is standing in front of the kitchen sink looking like Donna Reed in one of those aprons before dishwashers, and she's got a cup in her hand and the whistle's blowing, and they called it the Screamer. And she's complete. I'm frozen with the Cheerio scoop, and she's frozen with this cup and the dish rag in it. And when the whistle stopped blowing, it was like you came up from a trance. And she dropped the cup into the dishwater, and I can still see this splurp of water splash up. And her hands flew up to her face like birds. And then she realized that I was in the room. And one of the rules was that you never talk. Pictures that I'm going to be showing you tonight about the actual underground workings. Nobody did this in Ely when the mines were running because nobody really wanted to know how really dangerous it was. But I can remember she dries her hands, she puts on her brave face, and all I'm thinking about, because my dad is working underground, and I'm thinking what every person's thinking in town that had somebody working, is it my people? And for me it was my dad, and then my mother says, "Oh, Mike, I'm sure they're okay." She had 2 brothers and a husband all working there. And that was one of the universal fears. I asked Matt Luthen, and I says, "Matt, how long were you underground?" 44 years, he said. And I said, "What kept you alive down there?" He says, "Well," I said, "I'll tell you, Iron Mike." He said, "I was a rescue miner, and I dug out plenty of guys that ran out of luck down there." He says, "What saved me was imagination." And I said, "Okay, Matt, how did imagination help you out in the mines?" He says, "Well, they'd put me in an area to work, and I'd look above my head, and I could imagine what was going to come down in about 20 minutes, and I wouldn't stay there." And some guys didn't have imagination, and they would stay there. A lot of the stories I got were from guys that had worked underground, and once I started to work at the Sedan mine, and they found out that I was sincere about telling their story. They were terribly mean to me at first. I'd get these guys and I'd say, "Rudy, what was it like underground?" He'd say, "Dark." Come on, Rudy. Wet. Sedan mine, the state park. How many people been underground? Okay, quite a few. Sedan mine, 80,000 gallons of water a day to keep it dry. The Pioneer mine was 2 million gallons of water a day. And those guys would work in yellow raincoats and knee-high rubber boots because the water would be dripping through the timbering and the workings. And that was the good news, that the water would keep dripping. Because if it stopped up above you, that meant it was gomping. That was the Cornish mining term. The water would dam up with clay, and all of that extra weight would start pressing down on the works above you, and it would make this gum-gum-boom sound, gomping. And the old guys would say to the younger guys, "She's gomping up above us now. Don't be wandering too far away from me," because it would break in to where you were working. You might have 5-6 million gallons of mud and water and timber, rocks, God knows what was ever left above you. That would break in. Your only hope was to get to a raising ladder that would go up. You'd climb up above it, because if you panicked and ran down the tunnel, the drift, you'd run out of tunnel. And I asked Doc Grahek, he went to first Ely guy to graduate and go to med school. came back home to practice medicine in his hometown. And I asked him once when he was an old man, I says, Doc, you did the postmortems down in the mines. He says, yep, I had to go down there and I had to identify the cause of death and write a report because these things needed to be documented. And I'd say, what did you find, Doc? He says, oh, Michael, he says, it was no pleasure for me. He says, these were men that I'd grown up with, people that I'd known all my life. He'd say most of the time they'd find these guys holding on to one of the vertical logs, the stoles they called them, to make the square sets that were designed to keep you safe. These guys, they'd be holding on with one hand, holding on to one of the logs so the mud wouldn't sweep them off their feet. A lot of times they'd still be wearing their glasses. And Doc said the one universal thing that almost every one of those guys that died like that, they had their hands pushed over their mouth and their nose so they wouldn't suck in any mud. And Doc, the old man he was, he says, they didn't have to do that, Michael. That mud pushing in on them like that. So none of the guys that worked, I mean, some guys were meant to be miners. When I got to go underground, 1989 to 1993, I gave tours on the Sedan Underground. And I asked my dad, before I went to interview for the job, I went in and I sat down with my dad. I says, give me a crash course on underground mining, Dad. And he sat there for about an hour telling me the horizontal tunnels are the drifts and the raisings going up and down and how things were done. Good Lord, I looked like the Albert Einstein of mining when I went in to do my job interview there. And I asked him the day that I was going to start, I said, so, how do I know if I'm going to like it down there? And he smiled, he laughed at me, and he says, oh, Mike, he said, you go down there, take you about 3 minutes rattling ride. He says, you'll go down, you'll look out. If they got a light on the cage, he says, you'll see where the old levels were, where they mined them out earlier. He says, you'll get down to the basement. And he says, they'll open the cage and you'll step out into a place called Shaft Station. He says, you'll know. And for me, when I got there, I felt totally at home, but just real comfortable, at ease with it, and not a bit bothered by claustrophobia or bats. And I wanted, well, there were some people, this was big money, $1.25. That was, I asked my grandfather, I says, $1.25 an hour? Come on. That doesn't sound like very much. He says, oh, Mike, he says, that was more than a single guy could drink up. He says, I gave her considerable efforts, he says, until I married Grandma. He says, then that took care of that, he says, but we were paid more money. He says, I never thought that I'd ever see money like that. And I asked him, I said, what brought you here? He says, I was the sixth son of a small Norwegian farm, and if I stayed on the farm, I would sleep above the barn in where the animals were, and I could earn my room and keep because my older brother would inherit the farm, or I could go to America. And he had a cousin that was in Minnesota, and he came to Ellis Island. And the man at the desk said, what's your name? And he says, Svensson Tobiasen Jaiberg. And the guy looks and laughs at him. And my grandfather says, what's so funny? He says, well, you can't possibly think you're going to be successful in America with the name Svensson Tobiasen Jaiberg, for God's sakes. And my grandfather says, well, pick me an American name then. And the guy looks at him and he goes, Steve Thompson. Grandpa says, write that down. That sounds good to me. And he maintains, and I've heard this from another, so I'm sure this is just an immigrant joke, but he maintained that the two people in front of him were Sam Olsen Sr. and Sam Olsen Jr. And when Olsen Sr. registered in, his boy is standing next in line, and the man says, name? And he points to his father and he says, Sam Ting. And the guy writes, Sam Ting. And you didn't want to mess with the immigration people. And so somewhere across America, there's a Ting family. And one more Dick. And there they are, they're hauling it out. There'd be 6 cars in a train. In the early days, it was one 2-legged donkey pushing 1.5 tons of iron. When the mules came, they could put 6 cars. They could haul 10 times what a man could haul. And these were specially trained mining mules that were bought from U.S. Steel, made a considerable investment. A good horse in the lumber camps was $150 for a prime animal. The mules that worked underground in Ely were $1,500 an animal, and that's because they were specially trained. They did. If you see any pictures of somebody with reins driving a mule underground, that's not true. They were 2 years old when they began training. They trained for 2 years in underground mines, the old lead mines, and by the time they brought those mules up here, they were totally trained by command. And the only thing that the 41 different nationalities who worked in the mine for U.S. Steel, that was what they figured out when it was all said and done, that 41 different nationalities were represented in the mines in Tower and Ely. And the only thing they wondered about these mules was how they could speak so many languages. Because they could work for an Italian on Monday, and they could work for a Finnish tram operator the next day, and by God, and they were wonderful animals. They would bring them up, they would work 9 months, and then they would bring them up for a 3-month furlough. The mining, the horses, the ponies that they started with, in many of the mines, they would never bring them up at all. They would go blind underground. And say what you will about Captain Charlie Trezona, but by God, he treated mules and men pretty good. He'd bring them up for a 3-month break, and they'd have 7 layers of burlap taped over their eyes, and they'd get them acclimated to the light. And then after 9 months, you'd go back down for working. And the Sedan mine, the last level that they had mules on, the last mule left the Sedan mine in 1934, and you can go up to the 17th level and stand in front of the mule barns, and you can close your eyes and you can take a deep breath, and you can still smell those mules and the tracks that they left between the rails are still there. And some of those levels in the Sedan haven't seen anybody for 90 years. Time stands still underground, pretty much. The old lunchroom, the last day they worked at the Sedan, December 17th, 1962, they kept a few electricians on to strip copper from the motors, and they went to the municipal liquor store, and they went and they bought a copious amount of whiskey and brandy, and they had a last Christmas party down in the lunchroom on the 25th level, and the little Christmas tree that they cut that day and brought down is still sitting on the table, and the needles are still there, and it's just as those men left it, and there's a cardboard written with grease pencil. Merry Christmas to the men of the Sedan mine from United States Steel. Ho, ho, ho. And that was it. It's still there. Richard, there you go. You get them down to 2 harbors. Load them on the boats. One more. Truck her down the Great Lakes. By the time World War II was fought, Minnesota's contribution, 70% of all of the iron that went into the munitions, the tanks, the trucks, the planes, the ships. It was all Mesabi range iron for the most part. But the thing about Vermilion and Ely and Sedan iron, it was vital to the mix. 2,000 pounds of Mesabi iron would be dumped into an open hearth kettle, and some little guy with an Irish baby buggy, that's a wheelbarrow, he would go to the special iron bin for vermilion lump ore. That's what they called it. And he would load that wheelbarrow up with 60 pounds of iron from Vermilion Range. And he would dump that into the kettle. And the Vermilion iron was 30% higher in oxygen than the Mesabi iron, and it would burn hotter. It would break through the carbon slag on the top of the kettles. That extra oxygen made a better steel product, and all that ended in the 1960s with blast furnaces. Put a blast of oxygen into the liquid steel, and you didn't need to mine here anymore. The cost, $3 a ton to mine in Ely, a nickel a ton in Virginia and Hibbing on the big Mesabi. So as soon as they didn't need it, let's go to the mining. As long as we're talking miners, let's go. Aren't computers wonderful? And especially to have someone like Dick Watson here who actually knows how to work it. He says that probably on down the line, you know, we'll be trainable. Are we having a lift off here, Dick?
Where would you like to
go? Let's go to the miners. We're talking about miners here, and I wanted to include some of these photographs because people would very rarely see some of the underground workings. And starting out, that's a Chandler mine. The depot is right back up there, and they're starting with surface mining here. They found out the Pioneer mine where the A shaft is across from the Grand Ely Lodge. They call that the Pioneer mine because that's where they first hit the iron. That was the number 8 exploration shaft, but after they had discovered the main body, they realized that if you went close back to Ely, that these big pillars of iron that had come up from deep underground had been broken horizontally. And so instead of having to go to all the bother of sinking shafts at the Pioneer, they cleaned up the Chandler mine started. And these guys didn't take much training, but if you wanted to make some money, and you might have, they mixed everybody up, you might have a Serbian with an Italian, with a Finn, everybody was mixed up because the one thing that Captain Charlie Trezona, who was the most powerful man from 1902 until 1931, and he was U.S. Steel's hand-picked mining captain. And he ran the show pretty much for that time. But it started off the Chandler mine. They're mining this broken iron, and the difference between Ely and Sedan, Ely iron is broken up, brecciated hematite, fancy word for broken iron. It's broken up into pieces. They called it the popcorn. It was set in calcium carbonate because it had been underwater. So they would blow this iron, it would come falling down, it would look like yellow popcorn lumps. And you would rinse the carbonate off, and here would be this beautiful blue, 68% pure iron. It was like stealing. Some of these guys were on a contract. My dad remembers miners getting into the popcorn. They'd come running down to the tool room. They'd say, "Chester, it's like manna from heaven. You got to come and see it. You won't believe it," because it would be, you'd make big money. And then you'd mine it out. They'd adjust your contract, and then the next month might not be so good. So make hay when the sun shines. Dick? They're coming out. That's the Pioneer mine. That's the shaft house. You can see this guy. He'd been underground, and he is going to take a shower, and he is going to head down to one of the 46 saloons and 6 churches for plenty. That's Billy Sunday. Billy Sunday was a semi-pro baseball player with the Chicago White Sox, and he'd come up 5, 6, 7 summers in a row around the turn of the 19th century, and he would have evangelistic crusades. Well, he loved to play baseball in the daytime, and then he'd be up Washington Auditorium at night, and he'd be wrestling with the devil. Well, St. Paul newspaper guy comes up and says, "Reverend Sunday, you've been fighting the devil in Ely, Minnesota for 7 summers now. isn't there any other places that warrant your services? And he says, oh my goodness, he says, you don't understand what a Sodom and Gomorrah I'm dealing with up there. He says, there's 46 saloons, 6 brothels, and 4 churches up there. He says, the only difference between hell and Ely, Minnesota is that Ely, Minnesota's got a railroad running to it. So I'll be plenty of busy up there for some time to come. But these guys, this is right at the end. You've been, the people that have been underground at the Sedan mine. The Pioneer was so prolific that in order to get the volume of iron out, everything had to be double wide. So instead of 1 railroad track, you had 2 underground on all of the different levels. And this is like 1964. They knew, everybody was hoping that it would go on forever. But the Sedan had already closed, and the Zenith was on its last legs. And the big hope was that they had just opened up a brand new level in the Pioneer, and it would be the 18th level, and it took over a year to develop the works to get to the point where you could produce iron. And they thought, well, my God, U.S. Steel's not going to go to this big expenditure and then not mine it. And on April 1st, 1967, Superintendent Dick was running the Pioneer mine, and he got a call, a half-hour notice that the superintendent was given before the men were told that it was all over. But before they did it, Johnny Pouchnick, the accordion player that you can see on Channel 11, and his dad was one of the last mining captains, and U.S. Steel, they were sentimental. This was the last underground mine that they had in the United States. And this is where all of the stockholders, when they would come up to play golf and to go out to Oliver Island and recreate on Burnside, who wanted to see the open pits on the Mesabi? You wanted to come up and go underground at the Sedan and come and take a look at Ely. But they lined all the guys up during the lunch hour, and they wanted to take their picture just to remember what the workings were like. And now they're underwater. Trout are probably swimming there for all I know. The side dump, these are Granby cars. Young engineer made his fortune. Instead of end dumping cars, this guy Granby, he invented a side dump. The shaft is right there. That guy's a lander. What do I do? The immigrant man said, it's easy, Sven. You take her from there and you land her in there. He goes, I'm a lander then. Yep, you're a lander. And it's simple names. And you'd take 6 tons of this iron and up you'd go. Next shot, Dick. There the boys are getting ready. You see, everybody thinks of iron as red because it was oxide. These guys would come up with the coveralls would be stained with rust water. And I can remember the rule was you never washed your dad's mining clothes with the regular laundry. And my sister Judy was going for the Betty Crocker Homemaker of Tomorrow award, and she washed the old man's coveralls with his underwear. And rumor has it from other guys that he went to work with pink underwear at the Zenith mine for a number of weeks. And finally, he stood up in his boxer shorts and says, yes, they're pink. Takes a hell of a man to wear pink underwear in this mine. But those guys are loading fuses. There's dynamite in there, 46, maybe 50 charges, and everyone was rigged differently, so they would blow individually from the inside out, so everything would fall in on itself rather than be scattered all over the place. He's doing light duty work. Some of these my dad worked with a guy named Tabruzio Colombo. And World War II, and the old man he was no good for anything else. But he would tie fuses all day, and my dad would say broken English and Italian. He'd sit there because his boy Carlo was fighting in Italy at a place called Monte Cassino. And Tabruzio Colombo was from a little village at the foot of Monte Cassino. And he knew what Carlo was in for. And he'd be sitting there, my dad would say, they no make, they no make. He says, a mountain and a mountain and a mountain, they no make. He says, they won the battle, they took the abbey. The old man comes strutting in, proud as a peacock. I know they make, I know they make. D'Abruzio's boy, Carlo, he's there. Very proud. They'd tie the fuses. That's the Sedan drift. The miners never rode back and forth to work. That was for supplies or iron. You'd get off the man cage and you'd start working. The water would be coming down this side. In the Ely mines, it was quite a torrent of water, and they'd have college guys that would work in the summertime, and some of these college guys were pretty cocky, and the old men would send them up into some of the levels that had been mined out, and they'd go in circles. And they knew that these kids would get lost, and they'd let them wander around there for an hour or so, and these old men would come up and say, oh, look at the college professor. You couldn't even find your way out of a mine, you puddin'head. And the rule was, because you could get lost, and the rule was follow the water. And that's the same rule for any underground mine. If you're underground and you're wondering which way to go, follow the water, because it's going to take you back to the main shaft, because they got to pump it out. That's quite an undertaking. That's why you could never visit. People would say, how come we couldn't pump the Ely mines out and do one up on those Sedan people? And I'd say, my goodness, they're 80,000 gallons of water, and we'd be pumping 2 million to keep it sort of dry. It just, you'd go broke. But there they are. 450 men were laid off when the Pioneer mine closed. Most of them were pensioned out, or they went down to Mintac. And Mintac, you can imagine, these guys are underground men, and Mintac's an open pit mine, taconite mine. And the Mintac people are going, what in the hell are we going to do with a bunch of hard rock miners from Ely? And they got there, and they ended up being about the best men that they'd ever seen, because they weren't paid by the hour. They got paid for doing. If you were a contract miner, you got paid by the piece. They called it piecework. You got paid piece by piece, and the more pieces you got out, the more money you'd make. And as far as unions go, you'll hear every now and then a council person in Ely will talk about what a good union town Ely was. And that wasn't exactly the case. There was a lot of these guys that they would be, if you were doing tunnels, you get paid by the foot. And some guys were better at it than other guys, and these guys were getting, why should I be paid the same amount that he gets paid? And so it wasn't until 1939 that the Ely mines unionized, and it wasn't until 1944 that Sedan finally went over to the unions. And a lot of that was the 8-hour day. That these guys that would start, you talk about seasonal depression, that these guys worked. When my grandfather started, you go underground at 7 o'clock and you wouldn't get up until 6 in the evening. And they would be working this time of year, dark to dark. That you'd go down and you'd work 5 hours, you'd have an hour lunch break, and then you'd do another 5 hours. So you were 11 hours a day, and this time of year, you saw the sun one day a week, and that was Sunday. I asked my grandpa what his life was like, and he says, well, he's an immigrant man. He said, I stayed in the Swede boarding house, and there were 2 beds to a room, and there were 2 men to a bed. And they'd rent the bed out. If you were working day shift, they'd rent my shift, you know, you'd rotate. And it was awful crowded on Sunday when the mine didn't close. There'd be 2 men to a bed and 4 to a room. But you'd go, I know this is before 1916, because they're all wearing candles. And you can see the size of the logs that are going to go underground to hold the works up, so everything doesn't come down on you. And you got people from every walk of life. And my dad spoke good Italian, he spoke good Finn, and he spoke good Slovenian. And I says, are you just a gifted linguist? And he says, hell no, Mike. He says, when I started, they'd put me to work with the Finn guys, and I'd pick up Finn, and when I learned enough of it, just to be mean-spirited more than anything, then they'd move me with Italians. And so he picked up, I asked one Finn guy, Gene Lytle was his given name. No miner used his real name. Everybody had nicknames underground. And Gene Lytle's nickname was Koga. And I figure, like yelling in there, he's a good Finn. So I says, Koga, what the heck does Koga mean in Finn? He says, oh, that's not Finn. He says, that's Slovenian. And I says, wait a minute, you're Finn. He says, well, yeah. He says, but I worked with Slovenians in the mine, and they talk Slovenian, and they get done, and I'd say, what? And what is Koga in Slovenian? These old guys would look at him and say, Koga, 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 what? But it prevented in Ely, the one thing it did do, there were no pockets. I mean, when it first started, the Slovenians lived on the east end of Ely. The Finnish people would live on Finn Hill by Shagwell Lake, and then later on, for some reason, Finnish people like swampland, and they settled in pockets, Conan Street south towards Beacon Hill. And then on the west end of town, there were the crazy Finns and the crazy Slovenians, because they lived together and everybody got along well, but the blue blood people thought they were all crazy. And if there was a surface explosion that went on from like Shagwell Lake, the Slovenian people would say, the Finnish Navy is out fishing again. And the DuPont spinner, dynamite in a square hook, and the Finns referred to the Slovenians as garlic eaters. And my dad was neutral French, Canadian, Irishman, and he would relate these wonderful stories of these Finns and Slovenians looking over the lunch table. What are you eating, Eno? Grapes. What? What's a grape? And he'd slide the box over. Oh, he mean grapes. Grapes. But the different nationalities, there was a rumor that Slovenians didn't marry Finn people and vice versa. Bunk 'em. I ran the radio station, and they had the maiden names of women, and there was plenty of intermingling among the races. One of the best times I had was at Grace Lutheran Church and Bill Fossum. They're doing a double header. Father Hoffman is at the Grace Lutheran Church because Urho Hokanen is a Finn, but Antoinette Hokanen is a Catholic. So they're not hedging their bets. They're going to put money on both camps. And Father Hoffman, he's used to having the big pulpit at St. Anthony's, so he's at the Grace Lutheran Church, and Bill Fossum, it's Father Hoffman's turn, and he goes up to the big lectern, and Bill Fossum goes, Dennis, you get the little lectern here. But there would be mixing of the nationalities and the races, and some of the best stories that I ever heard were at funerals. These guys wouldn't come out for very many social occasions, and so if I knew a miner would be dying, I'd go there and sit and talk to these guys. And there you go, from 1888 when the first train left, and one of the jobs, they had rock boys in the early mines in Cornwall, and some of these Cornish miners seemed to be just real hard, mean-spirited men. And I got to go over to Geever in Cornwall, and I got to go into the workings, and they were 300 years old. And so I was too tall, and I'm stooped down, and I'm following a guy named Art Dunstan. He's giving me the tour, and I come by, and there's this little tiny box, 2 foot wide by 3 foot long, with 2 handles on the end of it. And I said, Mr. Dunstan, I said, excuse me, but what is this wooden box? He says, that's the Rock Boy box, Iron Mike. And I said, what was a Rock Boy? They'd quit school when they were in 6th grade. They were 10 years old. And Dad would have 5 beeswax candles, and the Rock Boy would go from area to area and fill that box with rocks and run as fast as they could, him and the partner, back to the main shaft. And they had a big bucket in the shaft called the whim. And they'd dump that load and they'd run back as fast as they could, because it gets warm underground. The deeper you go, the warmer it gets. And the boys couldn't dally because the beeswax candle would be wedged into the rock. And the miner, the father, would be so busy hammering away, he wouldn't have time to turn the candle. And if you didn't turn the candle away from the heat, the whole side would melt, and candles cost money. And miners got paid a fair amount of wages, but not that much. And so these boys, some of the mine captains like Trezonia and Pengilly, they came here. They were 40 years old. They already had 30 years of mining experience because they started when they were 10. No smoking underground. 2 million gallons of water coming in a day. These guys would be looking like, what are you, crazy? But years ago, they had one of the mine shafts in the Chandler mine was all timbered and a wooden head frame, and it caught on fire and it burnt for like 2 weeks, and nobody could go underground. And they finally sent one brave Finnish explorer named Mackey to go down and check things out, and Mackey never came up. And they finally had to go and get deep sea divers from Duluth because it was flooded. And so to restart the pumps, they had to send a guy. But he's drilling at that angle because they're going to knock that ceiling stuff down. And you can see he's well back from it because you never know what was going to come down. Next one, Dick. There's he coming out, big smile. I made it another day. They'd have services at St. Anthony's a half hour before the shift for any miner that wanted to make his peace before he'd go down underground, and many men did. There you go. You can see the mud and the crud and the metal beams here because it was all broken, and you'd never stick your head out from underneath that legging and the braces. One of the worst jobs, and you'd pay double for, they'd mine out an area and you'd cave from the top down. So by the time you were finished with an area, you might have 80 feet up to the ceiling. And the iron would keep dropping from the roof of these works, and that was money. And enough of it would get piled on the ground, and they would say, Christmas time would come, and it would be, hey, you want to buy the kids Christmas presents, don't you? Well, I got a little job for you. I'll pay a double time if you'll be willing to go and scrape that work area out. And some guys would take the dare because they needed the money, and a lot of guys wouldn't. And I can remember I got a call one day, and a lady said to me, can you tell me my Uncle John Skunce was killed in the Zenith mine, and I'd like to find out if you could tell me how. Well, Checker, my dad, was still alive. And I came over to the house. I says, what happened, Checker? He says, he was cleaning up for Christmas, and he was in that old work area, and he didn't come into the lunchroom down on the level we were working on, and they called up to the next level because there was always a chance he could have gone to lunch with those guys. And he didn't show up at either place, and the old man said they found a couple pairs of feet sticking out from underneath a pile of rocks, and that's the chances that some guys were willing to take. My dad was not one of them. He worked in the tool room. The wooden shaft, this is the Chandler mine, and they're still wearing candles, and they're from all over the world. And just amazing. There you go. This is 1916. They got carbide lamps now. That's how I know. And you can just see how happy they are. This is a contract. These guys, or some guys would be tramming the iron out, other guys would be drilling holes, other guys would be scraping, and everybody depended on everybody else. That's Rosebud Novacell. And that's why I hope to get all the pictures together of many old people, because you can identify. But they're in the lunchroom. In the early days, they'd let the guys go and have lunch up top. But as the mines got deeper, one of my mother's memories, every girl in Ely that had a dad working down at the mine, lunchtime would come, they'd get out of school, and they had to run down with Dad's lunch pail to the Pioneer Mine, and they would have to go through the open pit area where the mining captains kept cows. And my mother was deathly afraid of cows. And Grandpa would say, "Don't run, Alice. If you don't run, the cows won't chase you." Well, she'd see the cows would look at her, they knew right away. And those old lunch buckets, that's all they were, was a bucket, and he had coffee on the very bottom, and he would say to me years later, he'd say, "Thanks to your mother, I never had to worry about dunking a donut. It was all pre-dunked for me from the run across the cow pasture." But then they'd go on, and here's the Pioneer, you can see the iron going down to shaft, and the empty train would be coming up. And there's an old crippled guy named Sarberg that worked down there, and his leg was bad, and his job would be to ride a train up and down those tracks with a crew of young bucks that were the muckers. They were the guys digging if there was any spills on the tracks or whatever. But the old crippled guy couldn't do any useful work. This is the Sibley mine. My dad made it 4 days. When he worked in high school, they got a job at the Sibley mine working when he was in high school. And the Sibley mine was the worst mine. Those guys are going to go in underneath this cave. There's the mining area behind it. And these guys would crawl on their hands and knees underneath this cave timber to get the work. And if you didn't want to do it, there was 10 guys. These guys would say, "You don't want to do it? Because you don't want to do it, I got guys down on the Big Mesabi right now that are just aching to come in here." My dad, he lasted 3 shifts, and he didn't know how to tell his mother. So he went and hid in the woods. And at the end of the month, his mother says, "Chester, weren't you supposed to be getting like paid for this?" And then he fessed up. Bobby Artesensi, Johnny Artesensi's dad, he went down to the Sibley, and he lasted a day before he got out of there. And that's why not many miners wanted their kids to do that work. Some guys were born to it. Some guys were a big kid, he's 16 years old. "Dad, I'm not too, academically inclined. You're not telling me anything I don't know, Joe." He said, "Well, I'm a big guy, and they're telling me that a guy that works hard, he can get a cabin on Burnside Lake, and he can have a hunting shack, and you could have a good life." And some guys were meant for it, and other people. I asked Simon Borgen once, I said, "Did you ever think about it?" He says, "It was not even a question in my house. I was never going to be a miner from the get-go." Every Saturday, they would take the profits from the Borgen clothing store, and they would put the money in Sammy's college fund, because Sammy was going to go to school, and Sammy was going to be somebody important. And Jim Klobuchar's, Amy Klobuchar, the senator, Mike and Mary Klobuchar were mining in Ely, and they gave birth to Jim, the newspaper guy who's now Klobuchar. My poor father was so confused. Who is this Klobuchar guy? He's writing about Father Mike in the Twin Cities. What the hell does he know about Father Mike? And I'd say, "It's Klobuchar, Daddy." He says, "Why can't those city people ever say anything right?" He says, "Willard Icola leaves Eveleth, what happens? He becomes Icola. And now Klobuchar leaves Ely, and what is he? He's Klobuchar." I met Jim years later at the radio station, and his secretary said, "He's Klobuchar." And he comes in the station, I says, "Mr. Klobuchar, I presume?" He says, "Oh, for Christ's sake, Mikey." He says, "It's me, Jimmy Klobuchar. I'm home in Ely now." But if Mike and Mary Klobuchar could have lived long enough to see their granddaughter, Amy Klobuchar, become the first woman senator in the state's history, they would have been so proud. I asked my father once, I said, of all of the men you worked for underground, who did you admire the most? And without a hesitation, he said, Mike LeButcher. And I said, why? He said, Mike LeButcher cared for his men. He would never put a man in a spot to work that he wouldn't go in himself. And that was pretty high testimony, because there were some people that didn't have that scruples. But Jimmy LeButcher, same thing. Every Saturday night, they had 2 coffee cans, one for him and one for his brother. And you're going to go to the university. We're back. Let's go show some logging, and then we'll do some. Yeah, it's 8 o'clock. If anybody's got to go, any questions? Must be doing okay. We have a liftoff?
Hey Mike, how do carbide lights actually work?
You took calcium carbonate and you put it in a little canister, and you had a little water thing that would drip into that calcium carbonate, and that water would make acetylene gas, and that would go up into the carbide lamp on the head, and that flame. And depending on, everybody had their carbide set differently, and when they got Edison headlamps, the mining captains had special color rings on their hats, and that was kind of belling the cat more than anything, because these guys are pretty smart. You'd see a certain shine come up the drift, and you'd know that it was Captain Charlie just by the way his carbide. The lumbering in Winton, 1896 to 1923. The Quishaway River, which is an Indian word according to both Sig Olson and Bill Trigg Sr., who knew more about the Ojibwe people than I'll ever know. The Quishaway River means no land in between, because to the Indian people, the far side of the Quishaway River was the spirit world, and this side of the Quishaway River was the real world. And that was where no land in between was where the real world intersected the spirit world. So a lot of the visions that they would have, that would be sacred ground, and not many of the Ojibwe would travel there because of that purpose of that. You heard the word heebie-jeebies? Jeebie is an Indian word for ghost. And Indians are very suspicious about ghosts. And they'd come by an island where somebody had been killed years before, and these Indians would be getting nervous, and these white guys would be saying, my God, you're not going to get the heebie-jeebies on me, are you? But this is 4 Mile Portage. And you can see the logging trains. This is 1905. And you can see the size of the timber. And it didn't take long to mechanize. They started 1896. Billy Winton marries the boss's daughter for the St. Croix Lumber Company, and they named the town after him. Keep her going. 100 men, 80 men to 100 men camps. There'd be dozens of these camps scattered all across northern Minnesota. When they came here to feed these guys, the camps would hire hunters, and they would provide the camps with what was called pine beef. And that was moose and caribou, because deer was not native here. There were no white-tailed deer. When the logging started, it was all moose and caribou. The moose did better than the caribou. The last caribou that I could find record of was killed in the late 1920s on Burnside Lake, although one old man that came on a Wolf Center tour with me once said, there's a herd of caribou alive in the great swamp behind Cummings Lake. And when I asked old Harry Homer what I would need to take with me if I was going to investigate for the lost reindeer herd, old Harry said, wear a life jacket and snowshoes, because the swamp was so deep and treacherous that the only way you could stay up was to snowshoe it. And I figured if them reindeer are back there, God keep them safe and sound. They're notching the trees. It wasn't until 1900 that the lumber companies realized that they didn't have any more white pine seed. They had logged from Maine to Minnesota starting in the 1700s. And they got to Minnesota, and they realized for the first time that the eastern pinery was done. And they kind of turned and they said, we got to reseed it. And there wasn't enough seed in the United States to do it, so they went to England. And the consequences of that was where the white pine blister rust came from, the English trees. And the pinery hasn't recovered. Those guys are notching. You can see them taking the bandsaw. You can imagine the work. They'd get up 4:30 in the morning. They'd have a big triangle on the cook shack, or the cook would have a big horn called the Gabriel. And he'd blow this horn 4:30 in the morning and yell, everybody up, daylight in the swamps, let's get going. And you'd come in for breakfast and no talking at the table. It was all done 10, 15 minutes tops. Guys shoveling in food and no talking at the table. Tommy Leroy worked with these derelict lumberjacks up at Hubachek's place there. Hubachek hired a gourmet chef from Chicago, and these guys would come in for their meal. And this guy, he'd watch these guys never say a word, wolf down this gourmet food and run out. And finally one day Tommy Leroy said, I just wanted to say thank you for the food. And this gourmet chef who fancy play, he says, those old men, he says, rules in the lumber camp. You couldn't talk. Don't waste time. But they'd be, there's Winton, there's Front Street. If you went, the Long Branch is down here. The main part of Winton is just over there, the Fat Chicken Feed Store and the depot. And so that's Front Street because it faced the lumber yards. And Winton at one time was the largest lumber center in the world for a few years. And the Quishway River that was sacred to the Indian people when they started to, the last logging operations was out toward Babbitt on the Stony River country. And they would sluice that logs all the way down the Stony River into the Quishway River system through White Iron and Fall Lake and down to the mills. And the lumbermen referred to it as the cashway. There was nothing sacred about it. It was board feet. You want to get another one there, Dick? Oh! It's there somewhere. This is, again, the mill pond, Fall Lake, burning up the slag. Keep going. There you are. You can imagine what it looked like here. Trees like that. And there they go, the 1905 steam hauling. Teddy Roosevelt, he gets up to Winton. The logging in Winton dead in 1923 was the last mill running. That was the St. Croix lumber mill. They came to Minnesota and they said to these men, you won't be able to log this off in 2 lifetimes. And in less than 30 years, it was all done. They had taken it down. There's Winton. City's right back there. And you can imagine all of the iron trains leaving from Ely and all of these lumber trains heading down. And when these lumber camps would close in the spring, the 46 saloons in Ely were absolutely booming. They called it the Roaring Stony, and some of these men would come in, and my father worked at the Dinsmore Livery Stable, and my mother was a blonde-haired little Norwegian girl that would hang around, and she remembers these lumberjacks coming in, renting rigs to go out to Daisy Redfield's place on Wolf Lake there. Ely's first businesswoman, wonderfully successful, and I mean at the time, and the respect that people had for her was amazing. People loved her. She took care of her girls. She was fair and square. My great-grandfather was chief of police. He'd have to fine her $100 every month when she was within the city limits. Never held it against him. They passed that ordinance in 1931. No prostitution going to be allowed on any land in St. Louis County. And they thought that was it. They couldn't figure out how to get around it. She did. She went and she had George Harder get empty 50-gallon oil drums from Ely, and he took them out in a horse and buggy wagon, and they welded them together, and she made a floating bordello. on Wolf Lake. And when the sheriff came to close her down and find her with a felony, she produced the law. And she says, what does it say here, Sheriff? It says, there shall be no practice of prostitution on any land in St. Louis County. But if you'll look, Sheriff, you can see the SS Daisy floating on Wolf Lake, and the sheriff folded the warrant, and he went back to Duluth, and they started to mull it over, because it brought up an interesting question about who owned the rights to the water. And that wouldn't be decided until the 70s, when the federal government says, we'll do it, thanks. But they lived, Daisy. But Winton, you can see, well, good Lord, there were so many single men here, and there were never enough women. The women would come from European countries to work at boarding houses. The mortality rate for a woman working in an Ely boarding house in the 1880s was higher than a man fighting in World War I on the Western Front. They had 2 weeks to live if you were a British soldier. The women would come to Ely, and if you were a good-looking girl, these guys would be hanging on the trains, waiting for the train to come in town, and the word would go through the town like wildfire that there was a good-looking Serbian woman come at the Slavic boarding house, and by God, every eligible Serb in town would be there. And if you married a boarding house girl, you had to pay the boarding house guy a year of her wages, and you had to pay the price that because he paid for her passage to come over, and it was just business. They're dumping it in from the railroad cars and the embankments. They're getting it in to the water. It was easier to float these logs. There's the Pioneer. This is the kind of logs. Everybody wasn't looking for the big logs. The mining companies wanted smaller ones. So they traded north of Burnside Lake. The reason Burnside is Burnside, half of Burnside Lake, the north side was all burnt over just before we got here. So all of the pines on the north side by Crab Lake in that area, just perfect for the mining company. And lunchtime, that's a dingle. That's a swing dingle. You had a little lunch packed in there, the cook, the belly and butter and egg men, the belly robbers, the guys would be working out in the woods. They didn't have time to come back for a midday meal. And so they'd bring the lunch out, you'd swing out this platform, and the boys be taking a, are you sure you want to move this to the recycle bin? Did I do that? I didn't know it was loaded. But these guys who worked in the camps, starting wage for a fellow was $30 a month. Just sign on. But you got room and board. They fed these guys like kings. And when I went down to tell stories in Austin, Minnesota, Spam Town, they wondered how a guy that told stories about voyagers and lumberjacks and hard rock miners would translate in farm country. And I started talking about the lumber camps, and I was amazed at how many dozens of farm families that had sent men up to work because that was vital for, and I'd never thought about it. Most of the guys that I tell stories are about the guys that spent time in the taverns doing bad things. But a lot of these guys come up from Iowa and southern Minnesota, and when I was telling stories, it'd be my uncle Harvey spent a week up there, and a good man, you can see there'd be 200 pair of wool socks drying on a tamarack rack above a barrel stove. You can imagine what that bunkhouse must have smelled like. But if you were lucky, you had a guy, there's the pond. They got all of this on Fall Lake, 4 Mile Portage, and they're getting it all ready because when that ice goes out, that boom, that's a boom. Thousands and thousands of logs. And the one thing that people thought that Shagwell Lake, they moved the water from Shagwell Lake, the supplied water to Ely until 1931. And they moved the water supply in 31 to Burnside Lake because Shagwell Lake was polluted. And I thought it was city sewage, and it wasn't. They had driven so many log drives across Shagwell Lake from Burnside down the Burnside River, and so many of these trees had sunk and the bark had fallen off that was what led to the bloom of algae that we used to call dog water in the spring. But they're eating lunch, $50 a day if you were a professional. If you were a white water man, if you were one of the guys that could dance on the logs and take them down the rivers, you were gold. One of the most famous lumber guys, Stony Slim. And the problem growing up here is I knew that a lot of the guys that would tell me stories were lying. But I never could figure out when they were telling the truth and when they weren't. And Shammy Samrock, the old district court judge, had a lot of time because there was, there's not a lot of crime in Ely. And so he'd go back into the old cases. And he told me the story of Stony Slim and Dago Red, two lumberjacks working out in the Stony River country. And they come into town to have a hell of a good time. And they did. They had such a good time on Friday night that they woke up the next morning with only $1 left. And $1, you could still get pretty good drunk for $1. It was three fingers of whiskey was 10 cents, and a 20-ounce schooner of beer was a nickel. But for two hard drinking men, $1 just wasn't going to do. And so the judge says he concocted this wonderful idea in back of the Boathouse Brew Pub. At that time, that was the Lang Hardware and Mortuary. And if Jim Lang couldn't serve you in this world, he'd happily usher you on into the next one. The front of the store was for the living, and the back of the store serviced the dead people. And in the wintertime, a lot of these guys, early days, they were averaging 2 murders a week in Ely. One of the favorite things to do if you murdered somebody in Ely, the railroad track had a big bend in it as it came into town. And these guys would throw the dead guy on the railroad track right in front of the big bend, and the train would come through and it would destroy all evidence. But wintertime, you can imagine a winter like this one. What are you going to do with all of the dead people? And they hadn't the fineries like vaults or anything like this. They didn't have those yet. So Jim Lang would keep the dead guys in a shed in back of the hardware store. And these two guys, Stony Slim and Dago Red, supposedly they go in there, wait till dark, and the hardest thing they said was finding a guy that wasn't recognized in a saloon. And they finally found an honest Finn guy that had died from diphtheria. And so they took him up to the Dinsmore livery stable, and they got him pliable so they could bend him. And they bent one arm up. And the old bars, they had the leg where you would lean the guy up. They didn't have chairs. They had rails. So they get them all positioned just right. And the two of them, they put a big coat and a floppy hat on them. And they waltz into the arcade saloon on a cold winter night. And they throw the $1 down on the bar, and they say to Big Fred Fredrickson, they said, "Big Fred, our partner's been jilted on the wedding day. His fiancée took the train to Virginia. He's overcome with grief. But Fred, you give us a round of whiskey and beer, you keep the change from this first drink, and my friend here will settle up with you at the end of the night handsomely." Well, Big Fred Fredrickson, he gave them grade A service, and these two guys, Stony Slim and Dago Red, they saunter out of the bar, and the guy is still leaning there, and Fred Fredrickson comes up and he says, "That'll be $5.35, please." Not a word. Figuring he's deaf. $5.35 for the drinks, okay? Not a word. Third time he says, "Sir, I'm not accustomed to asking for my money more than twice. And if I have to ask a third time, there'll be a terrible price to pay." Not a word. Big Fred Fredrickson pulls out a pistol from behind the bar, and he shoots the dead guy dead again. Well, you just couldn't get by with that in Ely, Minnesota. It was a law-abiding town in 1905, and they had a formal inquest, and the barman was found not guilty because 3 patrons of the arcade saloon came in, put their hands on the Bible, and swore in front of Judge Van Blarcom's court that man had pulled a knife on Big Fred Fredrickson, and the verdict was self-defense. Well, I thought the judge was making it up. 1921, I'm going through an Ely miner looking for the first dead Ely soldier from World War I. I always find what I'm not looking for. And here I get to the April issue of the Ely Miner, and the banner headlines, legendary Stony Slim shot dead in Spalding Sporting House. Daisy Redfields had a shop in Spalding. His real name was Kenneth LeVigre. He was a whitewater man and probably as well known, a cocky little fella. He could blow log jams. The reason they would put up with so much nonsense, the man could look at a log jam in a river and he could tell you where to put the charges to blow it. And that was save thousands and thousands of dollars for a man like that. So he's down at Daisy Redfield's and he's with one of the girls and they're not open for business yet. And this is in the headline in the paper, 6:30 in the evening, a knock at the back door, and Stony Slim, Kenneth LeVigre yells, "We're not open yet, come back later." And there's another knock, and he's mad this time, and he gets up, and he opens the back door, and 2 shots are fired. And the first one lands in the door jamb above his head, and the second one goes into his good eye. And he's shot dead right there. And that's one of the cold cases that are still waiting to be solved in Ely. I went in and checked with the police. Beautiful horses, $150 a horse, and these are the St. Croix Blacks. They were considered to be the best logging team in the business. Just beautiful horses. Blacksmith, every shop had their blacksmith. We got the next shot, I think, is they're going to be shoeing horses. That's where, if Echo Trail Lodge, if I'm not mistaken, where the Andersons lodges on the Echo Trail, on the east arm, that's this logging camp. And when they closed the logging camp, the Anderson family just bought the land. Nobody wanted it. They tried to get Finn. They recruited Finn people. They would send brochures because the land had been just, all of the trees were gone, and they didn't know what in the world they were going to do. And my ex-wife is Finn, and how her people got here, the Minnesota government sends brochures out all over to Europe, and it's a picture of a happy farm family standing in a garden, and in back are 200-foot tall white pines. And I asked Vino Valcom, I says, "What the heck does that mean in Finn, Grandpa?" He says, "If it can grow white pine like this, think what it can do for your corn crop." And they got here, and I asked Wayno once, what was the best crop you grew? And he says, stones. Every year that the frost would heave up these rocks, and he would say that was and it's ironical now, landscape companies in the Twin Cities are coming up and buying these rock piles that these indomitable Finnish people, hard work. But Herring, there's Winton again. You can see all of the pine, and Winton's back here. And there they are. You'd have a second set of horses with a long 100-foot long lead. That was called the snatch team. And that team was started first, and just before it reached the end of that snatch line, the teamster would give a hoot, and that break the sled's inertia. And once you stopped, the sluiceways, a lot of the boundary waters will never be restored to its normal levels, because when the loggers came here, they dammed the whole thing up. And according to Bill McGee and what he told me in the 1970s, that these dams have now been replaced by concrete structures. And the reason that the levels of the boundary waters are going to be kept to where they are and not the way they were when God made it was because the federal government knows that this water is going to be worth something, someday. And back in the 70s, there were already plans on the Forest Service books that if needs be, they would pump water from here for irrigation, because they were already looking at places like the Oglala Aquifer being polluted, and where's California going to get the water from? You know? But the sluiceways in there go more logging. Bunkhouse, that in the middle there, that's the dingle. You'd meet, and you're somehow logging to discourage dinner time. They'd leave an open space. You wouldn't even have a closed-in area. And if you go up to Fensky Lake, there's a little structure there with buildings on either end, and the open space is the dingle. And that was from the old logging days. Going camp to camp, that's how you'd get to and from. Sometimes the halfway campground, where the Quishway River, where the federal government has the campground on the Quishway there, that was, local people call it the halfway campground. That's because it was halfway between Ely and the Stony River. And a lot of times with horses, you couldn't make the whole trip in a day. And then one more camp, end of Fall Lake by the 4 Mile Portage. You can see there's nothing left. Roosevelt sends the first Forest Service officials get to Winton in 1907, and Gifford Pinchot has dispatched them to make a special trip to assess the state of Superior National Forest. And they telegraphed Roosevelt back in Washington and said, "Mr. President, there is no Superior National Forest. It's gone." And that was when Roosevelt said, "This will never happen again. We're going to manage this from now on." The water wagon, they make the ice roads. That's full of water, and there's a little heater. Lunchtime, you boys don't be talking, just be eating. And there we're going. And you guys have been real good. It's 90 minutes. We could go on. I could do this. That's why they threw me out of the Holiday Inn. But if anybody has to go, thank you for coming. This is just a start. They have 15,000 images. And it's incredible. And if Lee Braunell and Shami Samra could come back and think about it going from a shoebox. The man had 8,000 photographs in shoeboxes. And to think we can do this now. So I thank you for coming. If anybody has any questions.